Welcome to Discovering. Tonight, we'll take a trip to Skandia to find out how a hobby like this led to this and turned into this.
It's kind of exciting being up here in the UP and having a steam-powered flour mill.
And I was an Ishpeming for the Snowshoe Hare Population and Habitat Forum. Stick around, that's all tonight, right here on Discovering.
The secret streams that flow beneath the cliffs of colored stone. Forest thick and healthy with birch and pine and oak. Surrounded by the greatest lakes this world has ever known. The black bear's awesome presence as he roams the hills and fields. Call of the timber wolf, the loon's lonesome trill. The eagle soaring high above, the trout lies deep and still. These are what I treasure, the only way I measure feelings that I have for this fine land. There is so much to discover when you're a long-time lover of northern Michigan.
Ask most farmers and you'll find out that farming is a family trait that dates back generations.
My grandparents used to farm out here, and they did it more to make a living. They had jobs, but it would obviously supplement their budget. You know, you didn't have to go out and buy a lot of food.
It gets passed on to the next generation.
And my father started just kind of hobby farming out here.
And the next?
Then that kind of led me into it, and we hobby farmed out here for years. Since I've been a kid, I'd come out here, had a passion to be on the farm, and grew up. I love tractors.
And the next.
I plan on sticking with the farm and taking over this business, and I love it. It's my life.
Each generation steering it in a new direction. When Skandia farmer Paul Wilson mixed his farming roots with his personal hobby,
I've been interested in steam since I've been a kid. I always wanted a railroad around my entire property, and it's pretty big and expensive, so I settled for a steam traction engine.
it led to a unique, and I'm sure unexpected, family business.
I used to go to the steam and gas show all the time. So once we were at the steam and gas show, I used to watch this mill run, and it finally disappeared. So I asked around a few people, and they said, yeah, it's sitting out back in the barn. So I went and looked at it. It's kind of dilapidated. That's why they quit using it. I asked them what they wanted for it, and they said, well, it's not in very good shape. They said, how's $300 on? I said, sure. So this whole venture started over a $300 flour mill. And this is the flour mill I purchased. Didn't look nothing like this. Meadows Mill is still in business today. They refurbished it. It's all new wood. They got rid of everything. New bearings, new shaft. They redressed the stones to grind hard red spring wheat. And it works wonderful. We have a 1917 Port Huron steam traction engine we're going to be using today to run our flour mill. We actually have several engines that we can run on this mill, some John Deere's and some Alice Chalmers, but we like to feature our steam engine every now and then. Once the fire is going, it takes probably, depending on how hard we fire, an hour to an hour and a half, depending on the wood, up to 2 hours. This itself is the actual engine. The big long barrel here is the boiler. This is the engine that makes the power. It turns this crankshaft. And this crankshaft runs over to the other side of the engine. And there's a big flywheel on there. And that is where we belt up to the engine. Belt is hooked up to a line shaft, and that line shaft runs in a building and it runs the mill. Once we got a good head of steam, we'll blow down the cylinders. And what that is we're draining the water out of the cylinders, because you get all that condensation in the cold cylinders. You have that hot steam in your hot boiler coming out the cold cylinder, and it condensates back into water. So we'll blow all the cylinders down and get the engine running. We'll ladle it over till the cylinder gets warmed up. Once the cylinder is warmed up, I'm going to go in the mill. We're going to set the stones. Once we got the stones set, I'll get the grain flowing, and then we'll run the engine wide open to get everything up to speed. Once everything's up to speed, we'll have the grain flowing in the mill, and I'll tighten our stones down until we get the proper grind on our flour, and we're in business. This engine is only probably running, I'm estimating about 200 RPM, and that's wide open when we're running the mill. Spinning the other pulley at about 510 RPM, which puts my mill at about 610, 620 RPMs. The target range is 600. I can run that mill anywhere from 500 RPM to 700. Optimum is about 600. I tend to run it slightly over in case we get into a hard pull. 610 RPM is its sweet spot. Okay, so what I'm doing now is called setting the stones, because the stones move closer and farther apart to get our grind. And I'm just gonna run them up until they touch and back them off slightly. Okay, so they're really close right now. So we're gonna speed the mill up, we're gonna get the grain flowing, and then we're gonna tighten them up a little bit more. We got two sets of screens here, so any of the large grain, or let's say there was a corn shell that got through the other mill, it would just come off and fall onto the floor. And as they're falling through this portion of the mill right here, if you have any light chaff or dust that worked through from the shaking of the machine, it blows it out here. So it's another cleaning aspect, which is really nice with this mill. I monitor the temperature of all my bearings and the temperature of the grain. We try not to overheat our grain. We mill as cool as possible. We try to stay with the air temperature and the grain combined 150 degrees. The grain doesn't get that hot, but you get that hot air going through. And we monitor the RPMs of the mill. So we try to keep everything as consistent as we can when we're milling.
That's about right where we want to be. Looking good.
When we run hard, I run about 400 pounds an hour through this mill, so that's pretty decent production. If we ran straight for 8 hours, it's about 16,000 pounds a week. So we have the capacity to supply the whole UP and more with flour, I'm sure. All of our lubrications are food grade oil and food grade grease, and it is actually acceptable for direct contact, just in case there is any direct contact. We've never had an issue. We do keep the room clean. I don't let anybody in here without my supervision, obviously, because it's kind of a sterile room. Any of the cleaning that happens in here is all dry clean. We're not allowed to have any liquids in this room. So everything's all wiped down by hand, cleaned up. We clean this room every time we mill. So after we're done milling today, this room will get wiped down again. Yeah, this is a 24-inch Meadows mill. It was getting in such poor shape that they couldn't use it anymore. I called the factory, and this factory is actually still in business. Sent it to the factory and had them restore it. It's a 24-inch stone burr mill, and which is a fairly large mill. The biggest mill that Meadows Mills makes is a 30-inch mill. This is a factory original. This is how it was detailed when it was built. I asked them the year on this mill. It was roughly in 1920. Once everything is milled, inside there comes out this chute right here. This is where we check and monitor our temperature, and then it goes downstairs into our bagging facility and our sifting facility where we make all of our different products. In the milling process, once the wheat berry is cleaned and it fits through the screens in the cleaner and everything is looking good, once in a while there could still be a little chaff that is attached to the berry. We hope that comes off through the second cleaning going into the mill, but if it doesn't, after it's milled, it comes detached. So The first screen on here, we call it our scalping screen. Second one down, it scalps off all of the chaff, if any makes it through, and it comes down through this pipe here. When we're making our all-purpose, we're gonna pull off all the bran, and that's the next two screens. Our flour will be coming down through this pipe into our hand bagger. These are the screens that are actually in our sifter. This is our ultra fine. You can't hardly see the holes in it, it's so fine. And you'll notice that there's some balls underneath there rolling around. So this is actually going like this. And what them balls do is they bounce around on this really large screen, and if the holes get plugged, they unplug the holes. We started this whole business, we milled, we sifted, and we bagged everything in the mill room. After the company started taking off and we realized that this was going to keep going, we expanded. We mill everything fresh to order. It might sit here for a day or two until we're ready to run, but in this day and age, for flour, that's fresh. It doesn't go sit in a warehouse. One thing that we can do, if you don't like the product that we're putting out, we can order different screens. So we can custom mill. If you want your flour a little coarser, a little bit of bran left in it. If you want real ultra fine, we can change our screens. Our ultra fine flour is more towards a pasty dough and a pizza dough, where you don't want it to rise as much. The gluten or the protein content is a little bit different. You're pulling more of the bran out, which changes it. When you leave more bran in there, your product will be a little more dense. So this is an all-purpose flour. It's a little coarser than your all-purpose flour in a store, but this is a traditional flour. This is what you would have bought 100 years ago. What we don't grow and mill of our own product, I buy from local farmers. So we go directly to the farm, we haul our own grain. My trailer is dedicated only for wheat products. We never put soybeans or fertilizer or anything else in it. This is a grain cleaner. Basically, they call it a fanning mill in the old days, grain cleaner. When we talk about cleaning the grain, we're taking any of the unthreshed grain out of the wheat berry. So what we're after is the wheat berry. So basically anything with the chaff still on the berry, there's different screens in there. It'll eliminate the large stuff. Any immature seed that's small and didn't develop, it'll go through the small screens. Your combines pull everything off the field. So if there's timothy, clover, you'll also have all them seeds in your combine. It'll fan it out or it'll fall through the screen. So when we get our final product, we'll just have a really nice, clean, hard red spring wheat berry. I have about 10 acres planted here. We grow, harvest, we thresh, and clean all of our own grain. If we don't have enough grain, I buy from local farmers. I actually go right to the farm and pick it up. We haul our own grain, we have our own trailer, dedicated only for wheat products. So you'll never have any cross-contamination with corn or anything else. Once we get our product here, all of our grain is stored inside, so it's not subject to condensation or moist conditions. We clean all of our grain downstairs. Once it's cleaned, we haul it all up by hand right now. Currently, it's my wife Gina, my son Neo, and myself running the business.
I really like the farm because I got all these tractors and I know how to use them, and got a great dad and great mom, and it's fun. It's a really fun business, and we just bought this flour mill, and that's coming a long way so far, and I think we're rapidly succeeding.
We're expanding into more bakeries than they're opening. I would love to put somebody on full-time real soon. Well, we mill here fresh to order. We don't mill and bag it and put it on the shelf. We get our orders, we mill everything, and we send it out. So in the past, we've had some power outages, not very often, but I remember one we had that lasted for a week. Well, if we rely on electric power, we're kind of down for the count until we're restored. So we set it up traditionally with this line shaft, so we can run any of our tractors on the mill off the flywheel. And if they don't work, we can always rely to our steam. My great-grandfather had a farm out here in Scandia also, is just down the road from here. That's actually still in the family. He bought a 1931 panel delivery, and he used to deliver his products to Marquette, and he'd run around to all the small farms and pick up milk and dairy products and run into Marquette 6 days a week. He would not work on Sundays. Every year, imagine this in 1931 when he bought the vehicle, he'd put 25,000 miles a year on running to town. Most Model A's didn't see 100,000 miles. He had a couple engines put in it, obviously. I still have the original engine. We had recently restored that truck, and on occasion we deliver into Marquette, and we still use that vehicle, so it's kind of exciting. So if you're up in Marquette someday and you see a blue panel delivery, that's Liberty Farms and Flour Mill delivering traditional flour the traditional way. I was trying to find another steam-operated flour mill in the United States, and there might be some out there, but I couldn't find any. Our flour mill is state certified, and we are able to run our mill on steam. So it's kind of exciting being up here in the UP and having a steam-powered flour mill.
Snowshoe hares have disappeared from nearly 50% of the sites studied in the Lower Peninsula and 27% here in the Upper Peninsula. A good crowd was on hand for the Snowshoe Hare Population and Habitat Forum to hear about some of the research being done to study this decline.
Tonight we have our latest in our wildlife through forestry, snowshoe hare and bobcat populations and habitat. And we're really excited to show people more in-depth information about snowshoe hare and how they can enhance that habitat by using sound forest management principles. And what we want to encourage landowners to do is to work closely with a resource professional. That's one of the things that I really work at, is encouraging them to get to know their land better by way of a resource management plan. And that'll contain information on prescriptions on how to manage their aspen, their hardwoods, their softwoods, their swamp conifers. And what we have come to know is that the more a landowner and the general public know about the land, the more they're going to love the land, the more they're going to be supportive of practices in the community, in the UP, that are sound forest management practices that also enhance wildlife habitat. We want to show landowners how that by working with a resource professional, they can write a management plan that's tailored to their goals and objectives for ownership. Silviculture, which is forestry practices, is very flexible. And when you put it into a plan, when you work closely with a forester or a wildlife biologist, they can tailor something for you that will give you that mosaic of vegetative cover types that you need to maximize wildlife habitat. And at the same time, still do sound forest management. Very flexible, but they just need to sit down together, the resource professional and the landowner.
So I've been studying snowshoe hares for about a decade now in Michigan, Great Lakes region, looking at a variety of topics, looking at the effects of climate change, at the effects of habitat, if they're genetically related, trying to estimate the numbers, so all kinds of projects. And really what precipitated the work was the DNR noticed a precipitous decline in snowshoe hare hunting. It started about 20 years ago. Now that coincides with the decline in hunting interest in general. But there were some reports that areas that historically had hares no longer had hares. And that question kind of kicked off some of my initial research about 10 years ago, where we visited historically occupied sites and looked to see if hares were still there. And we found some of them did not have hares, and most of the sites that didn't have hares were on the southern edge of the snowshoe hare range. So that suggested some climate thing might be going on. But then we also found sites throughout the Upper Peninsula that didn't have hares either, which suggested some type of habitat thing that was going on. So those two lines of thought, habitat, climate, really underpin a lot of the work that we do in my lab on snowshoe hares. The bottom line is we're just trying to figure out how we can manage habitat to help conserve this species. To me, hares are just an iconic Northwoods species. You know, so when I think of the UP, I think of moose and wolves and marten. Hare's right up there with me. I firmly believe that through proper habitat management, we can mitigate some of the negative effects of climate. And that's one of the main messages that I want to come out of what I do tonight in my presentation.
Since about 2011, the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians has been doing research on snowshoe hare, trying to understand the mechanisms behind the impacts of climate change and what are attributed to habitat changes versus climate change. With fecal genetics, we're actually able to identify individuals with a single fecal pellet, and so we've been out actually, rather than capturing and doing traditional, what they would call mark recapture estimate, we're able to do that with fecal pellets, and so we've been doing abundance and density estimates with fecal pellets, but then we're looking at all sorts of other population performance parameters like stress hormones in fecal material and arboviruses and parasites in blood, as well as mortality and birth rates in hares, and trying to understand how that relates to habitat conditions for snowshoe hare. And then with the end goal being, if we can understand those underlying mechanisms, we can design better habitat prescriptions for future forest management practices that will, hopefully help mitigate some of those physiological effects of climate change on snowshoe hare.
Our number one goal in this is to get people fired up about natural resource management. Wildlife, habitat, and forestry, two go hand in hand together. Wildlife management is vegetation management. And so if we accomplish that, then we have found that people who know more about their land, they love their land, and they pass it down to their heirs. So it becomes a forest legacy. That's the ultimate goal.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next week right here on Upper Michigan's very own Discovering.